For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Did you know that services exports is poised to cross a record $300 billion this year, and that it is rapidly closing its gap vis-a-vis merchandise exports? And did you know that half of this is due to software exports? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host, Anil Padmanabhan. Last week, the Commerce Ministry released the trade data for February. The big headline was the decline in merchandise exports. But there was a silver lining. Services exports grew by a staggering 36.9% compared to February last year. In fact, cumulatively, for the first time, services exports are poised to cross $300 billion. In fact, they are rapidly closing the gap vis-a-vis merchandise exports. To understand why and how, we spoke to Rupa Chanda. She is a director at the UNESCAP dealing with trade. I began by asking Rupa her initial thoughts on the runaway rise in service exports in the last few years.
If you look at the growth that we've seen over, say, the last 10 years or so, take 2012, 13 onwards to 2022, despite the slowdown that happened during the COVID period, we've really seen a very strong growth in services exports. I mean, more than 3 times within the same decade, within that last decade. So obviously, this is a continuation of that trend, and I expect it to continue this way. The issue really is the dominance of software and BPO, IT and BPO services exports within this overall services export growth that we've seen. That's really been the one that's propelling the overall growth, and I expect that to continue as well. But the outlook, I think, is strong. It's good because the recent demand patterns and so on will give further push to services exports.
While services exports have been doing well for the last decade, there is no denying the sharp uptick after the pandemic. And this, when global inclement conditions are taking their toll of merchandise exports. Why?
There are several factors in this. See, if you look at global merchandise exports, we know the current economic condition, not just because of the COVID slowdown, but post that, the stagflationary pressures that we are seeing around the world, most of the advanced economies, the rising interest rates, the demand slowdown and all that will have definitely an impact on goods exports. I think that's really what's affecting. And a lot of our goods exports are discretionary, gems and jewelry, textiles. So these are not necessarily essential exports. So these are taking a hit. And in fact, that's where the slowdown is also happening. Apart from that, of course, the geopolitical events, the supply chain disruptions, etc., have also had an effect, and they have an impact on our exports as well. So it's both a combination of macroeconomic conditions as well as supply chain related issues. Now, if you come to services exports, I would say that there are linkages between goods and services exports, because when goods exports grow, services also get a push, because a lot of services support goods exports. So transport and so on, the very directly related services, especially transport and logistics, do get affected. But the overall trend, if you see, the surge in digitalization, especially post the pandemic, the huge possibilities in terms of fragmentation of services and they're being more and more digitally enabled, the uptick in demand for digitally ordered and digitally delivered services, all of this. So the demand conditions are very conducive to growth of services exports. That's one part. I think the recessionary side also has an impact, because when there are cost imperatives on businesses, especially in a recessionary environment, so the cost cutting needs will be that much more. The growth in IT spend and outsourcing to cut costs, that is something that plays to our advantage actually. So it's, while you could say IT BPO services are a sort of discretionary spend also on the part of companies, but actually they're given a push in this current environment of slow growth, stagflation, etc. So companies are also looking for offshoring to markets where they can, get scale and can also reduce costs. So I think this momentum That has happened because of demand side conditions, because of cost related pressures, as well as the technology which is enabling more and more digital delivery of services and breaking down of activities within services. I think all of this is what's really responsible, apart from the thrust that's been given by COVID in general, that, when more and more things are getting done remotely. So all of this together, I think, is really what's causing the growth in services exports, especially certain segments of services exports.
Along with the growth in service exports, there's also reordering of their composition. There seems to be a greater accent on cross-border flows as opposed to the traditional avenues of personnel movement. Clearly, India is acquiring new competitiveness in new areas of service exports.
If you just look at the data trends, and the RBI brings out this, the mode-wise delivery of services, and you can see that mode 4 has always been the smaller part because it's not captured and there are restrictions. But there's been a shift. When you look at the IT BPO part of it, it's largely now mode 1. There's been quite a bit of a shift. So I think technology has made it possible. The regulatory environment has given a push more to mode 1 as opposed to mode 4. And India has also become much more realistic. I think earlier we just kept on pushing about, a GATS visa, free movement of people for selected categories and all that. It's really not going to see the light of day. And we know that we need to look at alternate modes. So yes, cross-border services trade has taken on more importance. But here again, as I said, the real issue is going to be alignment in terms and harmonization in terms of data regulations. Not getting into restrictive policies such as data localization and, local servers and fragmenting the data and so on. I would also like to make another point, actually, because services today are so bundled and the way they are delivered, it's very hard to separate out which part is happening because of mode 4, which is mode 1 and so on. But I think the thing to look at in future as Indian companies also become much larger and become global. Many are already global and they have delivery centers elsewhere. So it's no longer that, cost arbitrage thing, either that you're sitting here and doing, or you're just sending people there. And also as MNCs set up more and more centers here, I think the importance of FDI-based services becomes more strategic. Because if we can focus much more on mode 3, which is, the commercial presence part of delivery of services, it actually enables you to do all the other things. If you have your footprint through a commercial establishment in another country, like a developed country with which you have a lot of business, it becomes that much easier for you to do the data related, the cross-border part, because many countries actually ease up for you if you have a local presence there. Similarly with the movement of people. So in my view, actually, the strategic way to look at it would be to give more and more importance to FDI. FDI tends to have less regulatory barriers. It's also much more palatable to countries because you're bringing in investments, you're bringing in jobs and value add, etc., to the local economy. So I would actually think increasingly in terms of a package of services where mode 3 helps facilitate mode 1 as well as mode 4.
Interesting. So this, are you referring to these global capability centers when you are in this?
Yes, I mean, that is also there. So see, for instance, once you have these captive centers, you have these, things which are offshore. So basically you have the commercial presence here of the MNCs and they're doing a lot of the work. Yes, so it becomes much easier then because, to move the people, because the mode 4 that we were looking at was often the contract-based and the independent professionals. That's much harder. But once it gets linked to commercial presence, it's much easier. So both ways, whether we set up centers there and, we have some FDI footprint there and then take people over there, or they are here and we take people over there. This, in fact, was one of the suggestions that had been made, that for certain categories which are linked with commercial presence, make it easier, facilitate. And it is generally easier to take such people.
The GCCs, or the Global Capability Centers, are delivery units created by the multinational companies in India. It is estimated that India accounts for 40% of the global GCCs.
Yeah, that's right. And because there are IP-related issues also, so once you have your own sort of captive subsidiaries and delivery centers there, it becomes that much easier for you to actually transfer the technology, do a lot of the piloting and testing. So, yes, I mean, see, India for a long time has actually been the leader in this. It's not just a recent phenomenon, but this is going to probably grow even more. And here, maybe the geopolitics could play a role, because when it comes to these sorts of IP related and more higher value or technology intensive things, I think India would probably be seen as a much more friendly country in that sense compared to others for setting up these centers. So the cost arbitrage is of course there, but the scale of and quality of the talent, the fact that we can do cutting edge innovation, the numbers. I mean, yeah, I think I was looking at some of these GCC numbers, and something like 2-3 million people are expected to be employed by 2025 in these centers. And which country is going to give you that kind of scale of talent, right? So that's very important for countries. And of course, English and all those other things remain important. The diaspora aspect of it is extremely important too. The fact that many of these centers have actually been sort of pushed by Indians who are there and who have wanted to set up a presence here. So that I don't think we should understate the importance of the Indian diaspora in the West. But I think the other important part is, if you look at other countries, they probably don't have the whole range of services that one could offer. So we are there even still at the lower end in terms of the very traditional back-end services. So you have a pool of people who can do that at scale and at low cost, but you also have the more cutting-edge areas like AI, machine learning, data analytics, cloud, whatever, as well as the middle end, which is the more traditional sort of web design, software testing, piloting, and things like that. So I think it's a combination of the scale, cost competitiveness, availability of domain knowledge, even though I think there are challenges there, because killing the people to get into these more cutting edge things which are coming in future, and having, either companies being able to do that or our academic institutions preparing, those are challenges we are going to face. We may not have the scale yet to the extent that the industry requires. But I think very few, or perhaps no country other than a non-English speaking country, would offer this kind of scale of talent. So therefore, that's what really gives us the edge.
Rupa is making a very interesting point here. There seems to be a happy convergence of circumstances, including the ongoing geopolitical reset favoring India. Is this then the tipping point for service exports?
I think so. I maybe I won't say it's a tipping point. I think this has been happening, but perhaps COVID actually really gave it the strong push, and now everybody is looking at digital transformation, bridging the digital. I think this conversation has become so strong, and the fact that many things can be done digitally, right? So the headwinds are very strong with regard to merchandise exports with the geopolitical uncertainties, but it's like, you're getting tailwinds in the case of services. That's how I look. And that's why I said at the very beginning that we will see a narrowing of the gap between services and goods exports because of this combination, this confluence of trends in demand, trends in technology, business practices, and a realization that many more things are possible digitally.
As India moves up the value chain, it faces a big challenge: lack of skills. It is a legacy deficit that cannot be fixed overnight. But is there a way out?
This is a very challenging question, because we have so many structural problems in the labor market. So drawing people into the relevant industries of the future and giving them the right skill sets, not just for today, but also for the future, is something that industry has to play a much bigger role in. I do not think the way our academic institutions or university system and so on are set up, they will be able to do it in a nimble and flexible enough way. So yes, to some extent, the curriculum and all of that, that's one part of it. But I think more and more of skill-based internships, industry, hands-on sort of learning. Industry will have to bear a large part of the cost, unfortunately. I mean, they'll have to do a lot of the in-house training and the forecasting of what are the skills of the future, and tie up with government, with NSDC and so on, and really participate in this. Some of this is already happening, as we know. We need to get the MSMEs, for instance, because in many of these areas, it's really got to be the small and medium enterprises. So I think skilling challenges there are the most extreme. So I would say very applied training, not just in a traditional university or academic institution setup, but through industry, through scholarships, through industry internships and things. This is really what is the need of the hour. And including in the digital space, because the emerging technologies and the future of work, I mean, the skill sets that would be required, perhaps they don't exist today. in the country. I've seen the skill gap numbers across sectors in services. You see there are skill gaps, whether it's financial, transport, logistics, IT, even in IT, health, all of them.
The good news then is that services exports is the silver lining in India's trade story. The bad news is that the skills deficit is posing a big impediment. And as Rupa points out, this is something which will require a very active role for the private sector and not be left to the government to fix. The big question is whether the private sector is willing to walk the talk. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNewsGlobal on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please do share your insights and thoughts with us. I am available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.